Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. During the last several years, I've heard interesting radio commercials for a law firm which focuses on defending men's interests in a divorce proceeding. Cordell and Cordell offers men the opportunity to defend hard-earned assets and legally protect access to their children. Our guest today is Joe Cordell. In 1990, he and his wife Yvonne created a law firm in St. Louis. Early on, when representing men in divorce and custody cases, the Cordells observed the challenges consistently facing men when it came to issues of custody, alimony, and domestic violence accusations. That's when they proclaimed that the firm would devote itself to representing men in domestic relations matters. Since its 1990s beginning, Cordell and Cordell has since expanded into 27 states with a total of 75 offices and 150 attorneys. Joe Cordell, welcome to Conversation.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Well, it's quite a recommendation that you have so many lawyers, so many cities. Obviously, you're doing something right.
Yeah, and you know, we didn't really have a roadmap for building a firm the way we have with this many offices in this many states. To my knowledge, there's not another law firm that's been built this way. So we've had a lot of trial and error. Fortunately, we tried to make our good decisions outweigh our bad. But it's helped that we apparently have struck a chord with a lot of guys out there and focusing specifically on their needs.
Yeah, and see, that's what struck me about your commercials is this need for men. I've read a lot of articles. I've done a lot of research before we started this conversation here. Among the things that I learned is that even judges will admit that there seems to be a tendency to favor women over men in divorce proceedings and custody issues, or at least there has been up to now. Do you find that to be true, and is that why you started your firm?
I do find it to be true generally. In other words, I want to be careful and not paint with too broad a brush. Certainly there are judges out there who are tremendously fair with whom...
I recognize you got to go back into court with these guys too.
but also I have to tell you that it is true that there are judges out there who do it right. Unfortunately, there are many who do not. And while I guess overall, if I were to compare what I'm seeing today regularly versus what I saw 15 or 20 years ago,
yes,
it's better. But the problem is not simply the judges, it's institutional. It goes much deeper than that.
What do you mean by institutional?
Well, you can start with the legislatures. I mean, we have in effect statutes such as those relating to domestic violence. I mean, domestic violence, if you think about the threshold of evidence as a practical matter, the way this goes down in courts in men's lives on a daily basis, I think many Americans would be surprised, and they would be shocked enough to where they would say to themselves, this is not just. But when explained in the abstract, when reduced to a slogan such as protecting women from violence in domestic relations, you know, that sounds like something that's worthy and laudable and that you should have on the books. But the way it happens on the ground is that the threshold of evidence are kind of squishy, so that in a domestic relations case, essentially an order of protection becomes a battlefield nuclear weapon. By that I mean it's available to one side and not the other, and its potency can literally change the dynamics of a case. In other words, if a woman makes a bare allegation, you know, he struck me, or even much milder than that, I felt an imminent fear of physical harm. What does that mean? So she makes the allegation, sometimes at the implicit, if not explicit, suggestion of her counsel. But in any case, and many times, I don't want to accuse the lawyers as much as friends and other people who know the system. Anyway, so the woman goes to the courthouse without the guy even being present. She makes the allegation. Now remember, one of the threshold tenets of our legal system is both parties show up, right? Well, she makes the allegation, gets the order signed, an ex parte order, meaning it goes into effect immediately, but the guy, his consolation is he'll get a hearing in court, in 10, 15, 20 days, as a practical matter, sometimes longer. So anyway, so she now has this order in hand. So the guy who is often a person who's never had any problems with the law in his life, never. So he's driving home, could be you or me, we're driving home, we pull into our driveway at the end of the day from work, suddenly a police car pulls up. The guy tells us we can run upstairs and get a toothbrush and pack a few toiletries, but to hurry up. So he waits there, and we run upstairs, and we're out the door. I mean, that's summary. We've not had a hearing, nothing other than an allegation, and unfortunately a tactic in a divorce case. Now, the downstream ramifications of this is not simply that this guy is sleeping on a couch in his family's home, in his parents' home for the first time in 20 years, and maybe for a long time. But what's worse than that is when he does get his quote-unquote day in court, he shows up, there are 25 people on the docket. As a practical matter, there's not a full day of trial. There's not even sometimes, in some courts, an hour to 2 hours available for this hearing. And even if there were, at the end of the day, it's her word against his. So, I mean, what is a judge who's concerned about their career and reputation going to err on the side of? Safety. Safety is ruling in favor of the order of protection. The ramifications for that guy professionally.
Pause there for a second. What you're saying, I think, is that judges have become so political that now, rather than to look at all the evidence, they're more concerned about if something bad should happen downstream, down the road, and they haven't acted correctly in the public's mind, then that could be bad for their judge career. Is that what am I reading you correctly there?
That sums it up very well.
Okay, continue on.
But here's the bottom line, Lee, is the effects on this, it's bad enough the things I just described, but the ramifications are much larger for this guy. Professionally, his career has changed dramatically. There are certain occupations now that are barred to him if there's a finding of domestic violence. As a practical matter, in a custody case, I mean, she's won, meaning that most legislatures have laws in effect that say something to the effect that if one of the parties is found guilty of domestic violence, the court should think long and hard about awarding custody to that person, which means if they're male, in other words, that on top of everything else, they lose. So, not to mention attorney fees, various other things. So this becomes so potent that what happens as a practical matter is that the man's attorney tells him before they walk in that morning, look, we better strike a deal. Let's do a consent order. And we avoid the gavel going down and finding that you're guilty of this horrendous thing that our culture loathes. So the guy, you know, under the guise of justice now is entering into a consent order.
Now this is at the divorce, or this is a hearing on the issue of domestic violence?
Well, now that's an interesting question. It is in conjunction. It's related to the divorce process. Amazingly, these orders of protection often appear around or during the time of the divorce. So they are a sort of process that's ancillary to divorce in many cases. But now some courts go ahead and merge those two. So yes, the answer to your question would be this is a subsidiary hearing of the divorce. Some will keep it as a separate hearing. But at the end of the day, it hugely impacts the divorce process. That's the reason I use the phrase battlefield nuclear weapon.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems rather unfair. You just said that time is limited. You're talking about an accusation that affects someone's life for the rest of their business life for sure, and their social life as well as how they're perceived by their community. And yet this is handled in a, forgive me, in a half-assed way.
It is, and it's diminished because people who've not had their lives turned upside down that way think that it's a mere inconvenience for this guy to be out of his house for, say, a couple weeks. And they think that it's no big deal for him to enter into a consent order, or they think that there are checks and balances to assure these abuses don't happen. But the reality is none of those assurances are there, and as a result, the injustices do happen.
Well, it's not like the neighbors don't recognize what's going on. I mean, immediately there's an impact there in how the neighbors see this couple, this man, this woman. You know, if they're members of a church, I'm sure that there is some impact there as to how that community perceives this man. Okay, and I'm not asking for legal advice here because I know that every case is different, but in general, if something like this occurs, other than going to see the attorney immediately, What should a person who's accused of this do?
Well, whenever we meet with clients, hopefully we meet with a guy in advance of any sort of conflict like this occurring. So if we do have the opportunity to get involved in the domestic relations case very early, then we sort of try to preempt that scenario. We suggest to our guy that anything remotely resembling a conflict, even raised voices and shouts, are something that if it happens and the police are called, the guy loses every time. So we tell our guys, walk away. Do not participate in anything resembling confrontation or conflict. Now, does that prohibit a wife who's particularly unscrupulous from fabricating from whole cloth an allegation? No, it doesn't. But it does, nonetheless, put her in that position. Now, I will say that that happens less often. Usually the guy will provide some kindling, some twigs or something with which the fire is manufactured.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think I read somewhere in one of the articles that I was looking at that in at least one case, a wife was making outrageous claims, and eventually in court, I guess there was a suit against her, and she has to pay him hundreds of thousands of dollars, and I think she even went to jail or something. Is this, you know what you know this case I'm talking about?
I don't know the case. It sounds like it was a finding perhaps of abuse of process.
Okay.
Where you know.
So sometimes there is justice in this system. I'm speaking, and I have to admit, I have also been through a divorce in which I was not well represented, and so I understand these particular sides. And I have knowledge of people who have been divorced, who it was actually the wife that was the the tough guy, the abuser, and yet nobody will believe that.
No, that's interesting. Though the legislation regarding domestic violence is written in a sort of gender-neutral terms, as a practical matter, it's not available to the other side of the table. Meaning, if a guy goes in and makes these allegations, he better have something very tangible before he's going to be believed, even for the ex parte order, much less when they show up for that full hearing, 15 days down the road.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's get down to it. Okay, so somebody, when should somebody contact a divorce attorney?
And this is really true of both sides, even though Cordell and Cordell represents men in 99% of the cases. But as to both sides, really, the sooner that they bring a professional in, the better. And the bottom line is that sometimes it makes sense to wait. Sometimes time is on the side of the person who's considering filing. The thing about divorce is normally time is helpful to one party and harmful to the other, but it's rarely both. And as a result, one party has to decide which scenario applies to them.
What do you mean by sometimes time? Describe what you mean by this timing issue.
Well, for example, we were going through a recession recently.
Yes.
Many of our clients own businesses. So these guys often proceed on the assumption that when they're broke, the last thing in the world they can afford is a divorce. When their businesses are doing poorly, revenues are down, layoffs, no profit, all those problems associated with the last 5 years or so.
Right.
But interestingly enough, that's probably the ideal time for guys to choose divorce. If in fact they know they need a divorce, then that's probably the time. If they wait till they can afford it, then their business has more value. They have a greater ability to pay maintenance, etc. So as a result, the financial pain associated with divorce for them is much greater. It costs them much more in good times.
I notice in your commercials you're not pushing divorce. Actually, you're like, if divorce is forced upon you, is sort of the theme of your commercials. So, all right, divorce is being forced upon somebody. Now they've come to see a divorce attorney. What happens at that point?
Well, when they come in and talk to the attorney, one of the things we like to do is find out, have they in fact decided whether or not a divorce is necessary for them. And interestingly, sometimes guys will come to an attorney to ask them whether or not they should get divorced. And in my judgment, and this is the policy of our firm among our attorneys nationally, is that they're prohibited from recommending divorce. I mean, that's a threshold decision that really should not be in a lawyer's hands. Now, interestingly, or perhaps unfortunately, there are many divorce lawyers who are perfectly willing to answer that question, and the answer is always yes.
Well, it's kind of in their interest, isn't it?
But
please pay me.
Yeah, but really there are so many people who are more qualified. A pastor, a priest, a rabbi.
Your mother, father.
Exactly, a very good point. I mean, key family members. So once, though, that decision has been made for other reasons, other than the lawyer thinking it makes tactical sense, then the question becomes the tactical or strategic questions, which we love to become involved in because we think we really serve the interests of our clients, and there's this inevitability. Let me hurry to add one thing. The core constituency of our clientele at Cordell and Cordell are not guys who want out of their marriage. They're guys who find themselves in the position of having to get divorced because their wives have chosen to get out. So the guys have this thrust upon them, and as a result, they often are interested in retaining a large role in their kids' lives, protecting themselves, of course, financially, etc. But interestingly enough, many of these guys in this core demographic, if given the opportunity, would choose to save their marriage.
I looked at your website and I saw some of the pictures of the models that you're using in there. I doubt that these are actual clients. And to me, you know, at my age, they seem kind of young, right? These are, how do I put this? These are perhaps children of a divorced marriage from baby boomers also? Are you finding that to be the case?
You know, I haven't thought a lot about that from that sort of broader generational perspective, but I think you're right. I think that that's probably what the demographics would show.
Have you noticed, you've referred to legislation or, you know, the law as it is written by the legislatures. Are you finding now as younger people become state legislators that perhaps they're writing laws regarding divorce and custody based upon their own emotions as to what has happened to them as perhaps children of divorce themselves? That they are trying to protect other young people from being treated the way they were?
Yeah, I think so. I think you probably have two currents that result from very similar experiences. One current of thought, perhaps more conservative legislators, is they're saying, you know, if we've learned anything in our childhood, it's that this very permissive attitude regarding divorce is not a good thing. So, you know, we want to encourage the traditional relationships. We want to make it harder to get through the divorce process, to disincentivize it. And then you have another who take from it the opposite lesson, who having walked through that same valley in their youth, decide in their adulthood that what needs to happen is this needs to be quicker and simpler, or they've lost all faith in the institution of marriage. So as a result, you know, we can choose to live together and operate entirely outside this Byzantine set of laws that caused us so much frustration in our childhood. So those are kind of two very opposite streams of thought.
Well, you make an interesting point. I mean, I'm a child of the 50s, and when I was very young, I can't think of anybody else in the neighborhood who were divorced. It wasn't until the 60s, and I'm talking now middle and later 60s, that suddenly a number of friends were had divorce thrust upon their families.
And that was about the time that, you know, it was at the time the sexual revolution, and there was a great social effort to liberate women from this archaic institution as it was characterized. And so no-fault divorce was being passed in many states throughout the 60s, particularly in the last half of the 60s.
In the 19th century, in the United States, in some states you couldn't get a divorce without the legislature writing a special bill.
Yeah, divorce at one time was taken very seriously. And you know, I wonder whether couples were in fact any less happy during that period of time than they are today, having, you know, this fluid opportunity to go in and out of marital relationships.
It almost sounds from the tone of your voice here that, despite the fact that you are a divorce attorney primarily, that you really don't favor divorce.
No, and you know, believe me, Cordell and Cordell can find lots of things to do and lots of areas of law to practice in. So you know, our success in the long term doesn't hinge on the industry of divorce. However, you know, I can say that we see firsthand the effects of divorce in the family. And so whenever we have an opportunity to speak to men, we tell them that look, for some of you, I realize you have no option in this case. Divorce is being thrust upon you because your wife has chosen it. Others of you, you do have an opportunity to consider it. And we suggest to them, you know, the challenges that are going to face their children and themselves in the aftermath of divorce. So we're happy to represent guys in divorce, and we do every day, but we want to believe that in each of those cases, there was really no reasonable alternative.
Again, in the 19th century, children generally in a divorce, when it rarely happened, generally were given to the father because he was the one most capable of providing you know, a home and money to children. And then it completely changed, and then, as we were just talking about in the 60s, 70s, 80s, then it was presumed that the woman was the best place for children to be. Here, now we're in the 21st century, 2013, almost 2014. What is the presumption of law right now? Or is there one as far as where kids belong?
There's not a legal presumption, meaning that, you know, the Supreme Court and other high courts have ruled that that is clearly a violation of the Constitution, equal protection, due process, etc. So while there is this prohibition and there's this theoretical gender-free laws regarding awarding children in custody cases, it's anybody who's in those courts every day knows as a practical matter that clearly there is a bias. And the presumption is that there's this division of labor and that men are really good at making money and women are really good at nurturing. Now those stereotypes are changing, and I do think that if we stretch out to 20 years or so, I think it'll probably be more favorable for guys than it is today in family courts. But it's not going to happen automatically. It's going to happen because guys have to demand that equality. In many ways, you can think of this issue with respect to men's rights in domestic relations court. And again, there are lots of examples and areas in domestic relations court where these injustices happen. It's not just custody, it's not just orders of protection, it's maintenance, you know, which is the equivalent of adult child support. Mm-hmm. You know, the generosity of judges on that subject when it pertains to women receiving it versus men, and other examples. But anyway, one way to think of this inequality in family courts for men is it's kind of the dark corner of the room of the civil rights movement that has gone on in America for the last 20 to 30 years. And we've pretty much shined a light on all the injustices that should have been corrected many years before. Racial, gender bias as it pertains to women in the workplace, etc. But the dark corner of that room, there is a dark corner, and in that dark corner are men in family courts for which there's really no voice saying, you know, there's injustice happening here, or at least no collection of voices that have any political strength, you know, to voice that need. I was just going to answer.
By the way, we're down to about 4 minutes left here. And so if there's anything that we haven't covered, make sure that we do cover it. But the one question I was going to ask, and you've alluded to it here, is that you're in 27 states, your firm is. Are you seeing in the legislature any changes in the color of the law having to do with these dark corners you're referring to?
Yeah, there are some very positive changes taking place. Not so much in the arena relating to child custody, more relating to financial matters on the subject of maintenance. And maintenance, again, is this idea that the parties have been together for a while and one party has become dependent on the other and as a result deserves support thereafter. On the books in the majority of states up until recent years has just been a blanket presumption that if they've been married a long period of time, meaning 10 years plus, if the woman has made substantially less than the man, then she's to get maintenance, and more often than not, maintenance for life.
Does the reverse happen?
Never.
I mean, if she has been the primary breadwinner and he's taking care of the children, which seems to be much more happening much more now than in the past.
It is now, Lee, but I'm telling you, it's almost not an overstatement to use the word never, meaning it was so rare that you had men who walked out of courts with maintenance orders historically. Now, I agree with you. Now it is more common. But it now only guys are getting those awards when they're insistent, when they're assertive, ambitious regarding orders of maintenance, etc., then they have a better shot. So there is still this institutional bias to stereotype on the subject of maintenance. So to answer your question about favorable legislation, it is happening. Tennessee passed a law recently placing controls on maintenance and limitations. There was a statute passed in Colorado that I think is much more favorable than exists in the past. In Florida, I think also in one of the northeastern states was in the news recently, either Massachusetts or New York. So there are some favorable trends on the financial front for guys.
Yeah, well, that's why I come back to younger men and women entering the state legislatures who have been the children of a mess and who wish to somehow prevent other young people from having to go through the same mess that their lives were turned into. A lot of people don't even think about what, there's the mom, the dad, and they are they're the parties in here. The children have little to say about what goes on. And I'll bet that nobody, and we got like about 30 seconds here, I bet nobody ever even asks the children, well, did you see any violence when there's an accusation being made, right?
You're right. It's very unusual. I mean, as a practical matter, as you said, children are hostage to a process that their parents, or at least one parent, chose.
Right. So it's unsettling, but we'll have to take this up another time. I do appreciate your coming down and speaking with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me on.
And to my audience, I've been speaking with Joe Cordell from the law firm of Cordell and Cordell. His firm primarily represents men in divorce proceedings. We're not here to sell anybody or any institution that you should go see. If a divorce is about to happen, do seek some counsel. If you want to see this again, we will be uploading this to YouTube. Thank you very much. See you.